July 24, 1943. The first night of Operation Gomorrah begins. The night over Hamburg began like so many others in the summer of 1943, heavy, humid, and suffocating beneath a sky smothered in low clouds that reflected the distant glow of war. But as midnight approached, an unease crept through the city's streets, a tension felt even by those trying desperately to sleep in basements and shelters, because rumors had been spreading for weeks that the Allies were preparing something massive, something unlike anything Germany had seen before, and though no one could articulate what they feared, every heartbeat, every rustle of wind, every distant thump of artillery seemed to echo the same warning. Tonight would not be ordinary. Tonight the heavens themselves would open. And as Hamburg's citizens drifted into restless half-sleep, far above them the first wave of RAF bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, and Stirlings, cut silently across the North Sea in tight formation, engines humming in unison like a single ancient beast stirring awake, their pilots grim-faced beneath red cockpit lights, studying flight paths and coded commands, knowing that what they were about to unleash was not simply another raid, but a blow meant to break the German war machine at its core. The moon hid behind clouds as if unwilling to witness what was coming, and along the coast, German radar stations flickered with frantic signals as operators shouted coordinates to anti-air command posts, the screens filling with more dots, more clusters, more formations than they had ever seen in one night. But no warning could prepare Hamburg, no siren could fully convey the scale of what was hurtling toward the city. When the first sirens finally wailed, echoing through alleys and across rooftops, families scrambled into shelters already thick with the smell of fear. Mothers clutching children, elderly men whispering prayers, soldiers and firefighters racing to their posts with a grim understanding that this bombing was different, that something monstrous was coming. At 1 a.m., the first British Pathfinders crossed over the outskirts, dropping flares that drifted downward like glowing seeds of destruction, bathing entire districts in an eerie, unnatural daylight. And then, like a door to another world had opened, the main bomber stream arrived. The night air shattered as hundreds of bomb bays opened simultaneously, releasing high explosives that erupted in thunderous roars across the city, tearing buildings apart, hurling brick, steel, and bodies into the air. Windows 6 kilometers away shattered from the shock waves. Fire crews struggled to advance toward the blast sites, dragging hoses through streets blocked by rubble, but the fires multiplied faster than they could be contained, the oxygen sucked upward by growing heat columns that twisted into the sky like crimson serpents. And just as the flames began to spread into uncontrollable infernos, the second wave struck, dropping incendiaries, thousands upon thousands of small magnesium and phosphorus charges that clattered across rooftops, through windows, into courtyards, igniting instantly with blinding white fire. In minutes, entire neighborhoods were engulfed. Wooden beams snapped in the heat, roofs collapsed, and people trapped inside shelters began to feel the temperature rising, the air thinning as flames consumed every drop of oxygen. Some shelters became ovens. Others became tombs. On the surface, firestorms merged into a single colossal vortex centered over the city, a tornado of flame that roared with the sound of a hurricane, winds reaching speeds strong enough to yank people off the ground and pull them toward the inferno. Firefighters watched in helpless horror as hoses were ripped from their hands, as trees bent sideways, as cars rolled across streets like toys. The heat grew so intense that asphalt streets melted into bubbling black rivers, shoes fused to the ground, iron railings glowed white. German soldiers trying to rescue survivors found themselves blinded by ash, choking on smoke so thick it turned midday into midnight. Yet the bombs kept falling, wave after wave, each one feeding the expanding firestorm until Hamburg was no longer a city but a single living furnace. In the sky above, RAF crews could see the flames from over 200 miles away, a volcanic pillar of smoke and fire stretching into the upper atmosphere, rising so high it pierced the cloud layer and caught the moonlight, a sight so terrifying that even veteran pilots, men hardened by years of bombing missions, fell silent in their cockpits, realizing they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. Below them, the German air defense network collapsed under the sheer scale of the assault. Radar stations were overloaded, communication lines severed, and flak batteries overwhelmed, unable to track so many targets at once. For the first time since the war began, German commanders monitoring the attack understood that their once proud air defense, once touted as impenetrable, had been utterly outmatched. And in the Führerbunker hundreds of kilometers away, reports began pouring in. Reports so catastrophic, so apocalyptic in detail, that even hardened Nazi officers hesitated to speak them aloud, because Hamburg, one of Germany's greatest industrial centers, one of the engines of the Reich, was vanishing before their eyes, devoured by a storm of fire no army could fight, no courage could resist, no propaganda could disguise. Hitler had once promised that German cities were untouchable, that Allied bombers would break against German steel, that the Reich was invincible. But that night, as the firestorm raged with a fury no human force could control, as the glow of burning Hamburg illuminated the clouds like a second sun, the lie dissolved. Germany's high command stared at the reports, at the maps, at the endless stream of casualty numbers and destruction estimates, and for the first time since 1940, a terrible realization took root in their minds, a realization that whispered through the corridors of power, through the barracks, through the shelters. The Allies can destroy us. Completely. And we have no way to stop them. It was a truth written in flame across the night sky, a truth reflected in the burning ruins of a city that had once stood proud and unbroken, a truth that marked the beginning of the end for the Reich, because after Hamburg, Germany understood that the Allies were not just attacking, they were dismantling the war machine piece by piece, and nothing could prevent what was coming next. As dawn approached after that first catastrophic night, Hamburg lay buried beneath a blanket of smoke so thick and dark it turned the rising sun into a faint, blood-red orb struggling to pierce the horizon, and the survivors who emerged from cellars and shattered buildings stumbled into streets that no longer resembled streets at all, but instead twisted landscapes of collapsed walls, smouldering beams, and bodies covered in ash, as though the entire city had been transformed into a graveyard, carved out of volcanic rock. Yet even as they tried to comprehend the devastation around them, even as they searched desperately for family and neighbors amid the ruins, they did not know that the nightmare was only beginning, that the Allies were preparing to strike again, harder, heavier, more relentlessly than the night before, and that the firestorm which had consumed entire districts was merely the opening act in a campaign designed to cripple Germany's heart from the inside. The RAF commanders, reviewing reconnaissance photographs taken at dawn, saw with chilling clarity that entire zones of Hamburg had been stripped from existence, but instead of feeling satisfaction, they felt a cold sense of resolve, because they knew that Germany's industrial capacity, its factories, refineries, storage depots, shipyards, had to be obliterated if the war was to be brought to an end, and Hamburg was one of the most vital nodes in that network, a city responsible for U-boat production, ammunition, manufacturing, and crucial war material that fed the Nazi war machine like arteries feed a heart. And so, as survivors sifted through rubble and firefighters, exhausted, dehydrated, soot-covered, collapsed in the streets from fatigue, listening helplessly to cries drifting from beneath fallen buildings, the RAF was already organizing its next assault, assembling squadrons of bombers in bases across Britain, reloading, refueling, replacing crew members who had been lost, and preparing to ignite yet another chapter of destruction that would drive home the message Germany had failed to grasp. For too long, the Allies' reach was now unstoppable. By midday, Germany's civil defense networks were fraying. Telephone lines had melted in the heat, water pipes ruptured, electrical grids shut down completely, and emergency vehicles struggled to navigate roads littered with burning debris and twisted steel, while thick columns of smoke soared miles into the sky, visible even from Denmark, drifting across the Baltic in a dark cloud that symbolized the death of a city. Inside military bunkers beneath Berlin, Luftwaffe officers conferred around maps stained with sweat and ash, their voices low, strained, stiff with fear, not fear of the air raids themselves, but fear of what the raids revealed, that Germany's once vaunted air defense had been outmaneuvered, that the British had developed new navigation technologies, Oboe, H-2S radar, that rendered blackout curtains and decoy fires useless, and that the scale of bomber streams now forming nightly over England was something Germany's depleted fighter force could no longer meaningfully counter. Many of Germany's best pilots were already dead, lost in battles over Britain, Russia, and the Mediterranean. The newer pilots, barely trained teenagers, were being thrown into the sky in outdated aircraft with minimal fuel, flying into swarms of British bombers that moved like airborne fortresses, each one protected by dozens of machine guns firing in deadly arcs. The Luftwaffe High Command tried desperately to coordinate a response, but radar operators were overwhelmed, anti-aircraft guns low on ammunition, and fuel shortages prevented sustained fighter patrols. Every alarm, every flashing red light on the situation boards, every frantic radio transmission from Hamburg's defenses reinforced the same chilling truth. The Allies were coming again. And when night fell once more, the citizens of Hamburg, those who had survived the inferno, heard the distant hum of engines long before they heard the sirens, because after the previous night, they could recognize the sound instantly. A deep, rolling thunder growing louder with every second, a sound that filled the darkness like an approaching storm too massive to outrun. Some tried to flee the city, dragging carts piled with blankets and whatever belongings they could salvage. Others huddled in shelters, praying the fire would not find them again. Many simply sat in the open, too broken, too shocked, too hollowed out by the previous night to move. And high above, cutting through clouds lit faintly by the glow still rising from the city, came Wave 2. More bombers, more pathfinders, more payloads calibrated to ignite what little had not already burned. The Allies had studied the meteorological conditions carefully. The dry air, the wind patterns flowing through the Elbe Valley, the structural layout of Hamburg's tightly packed residential districts. They knew a second strike could reignite the firestorm with even greater destructive power. And so, as flares drifted down once more, their ghostly light shimmering across broken rooftops and fire-blackened ruins, Hamburg braced for another onslaught. The bombs fell with almost clinical precision, tearing open new pockets of flame, feeding the embers left smoldering from the night before, pulling fresh oxygen into the vortex as fires leapt from building to building, merging into a single monstrous blaze that consumed everything in its path. People, animals, homes, factories, bridges. Entire families trying to escape were overtaken by sudden blasts of searing wind that hit with the force of a hurricane, dragging debris through the air like daggers. Some were pulled into the firestorm itself, disappearing into the inferno. Firefighters, who had already spent 30 hours battling flames without rest, were physically incapable of responding. Their trucks had melted tires, their hoses burst, their pumps disabled by falling debris, and many fell unconscious from heat exhaustion. The heat rose to over 1,000 degrees Celsius in several districts, hot enough to melt metal, bend tram rails, vaporize water in seconds. The ground shook not only from explosions but from the violent drafts generated by the firestorm's upward pull, the sound so deafening that survivors described it as the end of the world, a roar like thunder that never stopped, never faded, a relentless hunger burning through the city's bones. And in that night of terror, something inside Germany's command structure finally broke, not physically, but psychologically. Up until this point in the war, Hitler and his generals had convinced themselves that Germany could endure anything, that the German people were stronger than bombs, stronger than fear, stronger than whatever the Allies could unleash. But Operation Gomorrah was different. Gomorrah was not just a raid. It was not a battle. It was a revelation, a demonstration that the Allies now commanded the skies with such overwhelming superiority that they could bring a modern industrial city to its knees in less than 48 hours. As reports of the destruction poured into Berlin, the tone changed. For the first time, officers spoke not with bravado but with dread. The statistics were staggering. Hundreds of thousands displaced, tens of thousands dead, entire sectors erased. But worse than the numbers was the message written in fire across Hamburg's skyline. Germany could not defend its cities anymore. And as the sun rose on the second morning, its light struggling to pierce the vast cloud of ash and smoke hanging over the Elbe, Germany's leaders understood what they had refused to admit for months. The war had entered a new phase, one where the Allies no longer needed to defeat Germany's armies in the field to win. They only needed to burn away the industrial heart that kept those armies alive. The third night came with a cruel irony, because even though the fires still smouldered across vast swaths of the city, even though smoke still curled upward from cellars where embers glowed like dying coals beneath collapsed beams, even though the air hung thick with the smell of burned wood, scorched masonry, and the sickening scent of bodies that rescue teams had not yet reached, the people of Hamburg prayed, desperately, that the worst was behind them. But deep inside, beneath the layers of exhaustion and shock, Many sensed that the Allies would return, that the heavens which had torn open the city were not done, that something larger than any individual tragedy was taking place, something orchestrated with cold precision by commanders far away who were turning Hamburg into a symbol, a message, a demonstration of unstoppable force. And as the day passed, with soldiers clearing rubble from roads, medics tending to survivors with burns and smoke inhalation, and families wandering through ruins searching for familiar doorways that no longer existed, the Luftwaffe command scrambled to rebuild the city's defenses, relocating anti-aircraft batteries, pulling in reserve crews from nearby regions, deploying searchlights in patched grids across the outskirts. But every effort felt hollow, insufficient, because the catastrophe of the first 2 nights had drained Germany's confidence and shattered the illusion of air superiority that Hitler had clung to since 1940. Even Göring, the man who had. Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story. Once bragged that no enemy could penetrate German airspace, now found himself drowning in reports that showed the Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outproduced, outmaneuvered, and outclassed by Allied bomber forces that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. And as night once again wrapped itself around Hamburg, survivors huddled not just in shelters, but in the remnants of subway tunnels and makeshift trenches dug into the ground, unable to sleep, unable to banish the memory of firestorms that had rushed through the streets like living creatures, consuming everything in seconds. Children pressed their hands over their ears long before the sirens even sounded, because the sound of aircraft engines had already embedded itself in their nightmares, and even the distant rumble of thunder or the groan of a collapsing wall could send entire groups fleeing into darkness, adrenaline surging through already exhausted bodies. Fire brigades, reinforced by teams from Berlin, Lübeck, and Bremen, stood ready near the remaining waterways, pumping what little water pressure remained in the system, knowing full well that if the RAF returned, there would be no stopping the flames. And then, at 11:45 p.m., the first radar posts along the coast picked up movement. Large formations, dozens of aircraft at first, then hundreds, approaching with the same chilling confidence as before. The sirens wailed again, echoing through broken streets and shattered buildings, and those still capable of movement ran toward whatever shelter they could find, while the old, the sick, and the wounded simply sat where they were, too weak or too numb to move, whispering prayers that were drowned out by the growing thunder in the sky. The bombers came in higher this time, the RAF adjusting their altitude to avoid the unpredictable updrafts and turbulence caused by the lingering heat from previous fires. From their cockpits, pilots looked down upon a city still glowing at its edges, pockets of flame flickering like embers of a dying star, and they understood the significance of their mission. Not vengeance, not cruelty, but strategy. The destruction of Hamburg was a blow against Germany's capacity to wage war, a strike aimed at the factories, shipyards, and industrial networks that produced U-boats, ammunition, and steel for the Nazi war machine. When the first bombs fell, they struck areas not yet touched by the firestorm, districts with warehouses, machine shops, and transportation lines crucial to German supply chains. Explosions rippled through industrial zones, tearing apart buildings whose walls had already been weakened by the shock waves of earlier raids. Freight yards vanished in blasts that hurled freight cars into the air like toys. Cranes toppled into the harbor. Oil tanks erupted into columns of smoke and flame that rolled across the water in thick, black sheets. Workers who had returned to these zones in the morning, to salvage what could be saved, to retrieve tools, to keep the war effort functioning, were caught in the explosions, their silhouettes for a moment illuminated against the fire before disappearing forever into the smoke. And as the flames spread, driven by dry winds blowing in from the east, the city once again began to burn uncontrollably. The heat intensified with frightening speed, pulling oxygen into the inferno until firefighting teams were forced to retreat or suffocate. Entire blocks vanished in minutes, and the firestorm that experts had claimed was a once-in-a-lifetime event threatened to form again, fed by the precise combination of fuel, heat, wind, and destruction that the Allies had unwittingly, or perhaps deliberately, recreated. Above the city, the bomber stream continued unbroken, stretching across miles of sky, each aircraft dropping its deadly burden before peeling away and making room for the next wave. And down below, in the command posts beneath Berlin, officers stared in disbelief at the live reports coming in from Hamburg. The city's air defenses were failing again. The searchlights were too few to track more than a fraction of the bombers. The flak guns were running low on shells. The smoke from the burning city was rising so high that it blinded gunners attempting to aim vertically. Hitler demanded answers. Furious, shouting, insisting that the Luftwaffe should be able to repel such attacks. But even his most loyal commanders knew it was impossible, that Germany no longer possessed the resources or the technology to stop an air force growing stronger each night. And as they listened to the crackling radio transmissions, reports of buildings collapsing, water mains bursting, entire neighborhoods rendered uninhabitable, they realized the truth that no one dared say aloud. The Allies had reached a level of destructive capability that Germany had no counter for. Meanwhile, in the city itself, rescuers continued to search for survivors after each explosion, dragging people from burning cellars, guiding families through smoke-filled alleys, performing triage in makeshift aid stations set up in parks, subway entrances, and the remains of churches whose stained-glass windows had been blown out by shock waves. These medics and volunteers worked through exhaustion and despair, but every time they thought they had regained some control, another wave of bombs detonated nearby, sending showers of debris raining down, forcing them to abandon their efforts and flee for their lives once more. And as the night dragged on, survivors began to understand that this was no longer about surviving a raid. It was about surviving the collapse of an entire city, an entire system, an entire belief that Germany could withstand anything the Allies threw at it. The firestorms, the destruction, the chaos, all of it was a manifestation of a deeper truth. Germany was losing control, losing the sky, losing the war. And in the burning ruins of Hamburg, amid the roar of collapsing buildings and the sobs of people who had lost everything, the psychological foundations of the Reich began to crack. Because if the Allies could do this to Hamburg, they could do it to Berlin, to Munich, to every city in Germany. And deep in their hearts, the people of Hamburg understood that the war they had been promised would bring glory, and victory had instead brought them to this: nights filled with fire, days filled with ashes, and a future filled with fear. By the fourth day, Hamburg's destruction had transcended the physical and entered the realm of something psychological, something that spread far beyond the city's borders, beyond the crumbling streets and smouldering ruins, into the very soul of the German nation, and even into the halls of its government, because while the people of Hamburg struggled simply to find breathable air, clean water, and a safe corner of ground untouched by flame or falling debris, the Nazi leadership was forced to confront an unthinkable truth. The Allies had mastered a form of warfare that Germany could neither predict nor resist. Hospitals were overflowing with burn victims whose skin peeled at the slightest touch, with children so traumatized they could no longer speak, with mothers clutching infants who had inhaled too much smoke to survive. Doctors worked with shaking hands, lacking anesthetics, lacking clean instruments, lacking electricity. Surgeries were performed by candlelight, while outside, the ashes of home after home drifted through the air like black snow. Every hour, rescue units combed through collapsed buildings, calling out through the rubble for survivors, listening desperately for faint cries or tapping beneath the ruins. But more often than not, they found only silence, or worse, remains burned so severely they could not be identified. Yet even as the people suffered on the ground, the German High Command was locked in frantic debate about how to defend against attacks of this magnitude in the future. Some generals insisted on relocating factories underground, others demanded that cities be evacuated entirely. Some argued for a dramatic increase in fighter production, even though steel supplies were dwindling and gasoline was already being rationed, and a small number, the most honest among them, admitted that none of these measures would matter, because the Allies had achieved something Germany no longer could: air dominance. And what the military leaders knew, Hitler outright refused to believe. He ranted and shouted, insisting that Hamburg's devastation was exaggerated, that morale was still strong, that the Luftwaffe would recover and strike back with vengeance. But his generals had seen the reconnaissance photographs, the burn zones, the destruction estimates, entire districts flattened, their shapes obliterated beyond recognition. They knew that Germany's industrial capacity had been hit so hard that U-boat production from Hamburg's shipyards would be crippled for months, maybe longer. They knew that the thousands of skilled workers killed in the Firestorm, men and women trained in precision manufacturing, were losses Germany could not replace. And they knew that this was just one city. The Allies were already planning similar operations for others. Meanwhile, the thunder of the next wave of bombers echoed over Hamburg in the late afternoon, their silhouettes appearing through the haze like phantoms returning to claim what little remained. This time, American B-17s joined the assault, flying in daylight with a bold confidence that stunned German defenders. Even at a distance, their tight formations looked like steel walls slicing through the sky, their .50 caliber machine guns ready to unleash storms of fire on any fighter daring enough to approach. The Luftwaffe scrambled what few aircraft they could muster, mostly FW-190s and Bf-109s flown by weary pilots who had barely slept since the raids began, but they found themselves facing an enemy exactly where the Allies had planned for them to be. The B-17 formations were engineered to defend themselves with relentless interlocking fields of fire. As German fighters dove into their ranks, hoping to break the formation and scatter the bombers, they were met with a storm of tracers that forced them to veer off, their aircraft trailing smoke or plunging into the sea. Only a handful managed to get close enough to fire into the bomber stream, and even then, their rounds bounced off armored plating or struck non-critical sections. The German fighters that survived returned to base nearly empty-handed, low on fuel, low on ammunition, and lower still on the spirit they had once carried into battle. Below them, the American bombers released their payloads with the same cold precision the RAF had used at night. Massive high-explosive bombs plummeted into the heart of Hamburg's industrial zones, collapsing the factory walls that still stood, igniting oil reservoirs that had miraculously escaped destruction in the previous nights, and carving deeper wounds into a city already suffocating beneath layers of ash. The harbour, once a proud symbol of Germany's economic power, erupted into chaos as warehouses, dry docks, and shipping platforms were obliterated in explosions that sent water spraying into the air like geysers. Boats capsized from the shock waves, cranes toppled into the harbour with deafening crashes, and the smoke from burning fuel rolled across the water in oily black clouds. German naval officers stationed in the harbour stared in numb silence, knowing that the shipyards they depended on for repairs and new vessels were now unusable, that the U-boat pens, once protected by thick reinforced concrete, were surrounded by destruction so complete that even accessing them had become dangerous. And then something happened that shook Germany to its core more than any single explosion. Berlin received a coded message from Hamburg's local government reporting that tens of thousands of people were attempting to flee the city on foot, carrying what little they could salvage, forming endless lines along country roads stretching for miles into the countryside. Entire neighborhoods had emptied. Trains had stopped running. Public services had collapsed. For the first time in the war, a major German city was experiencing a mass civilian exodus, not a strategic evacuation ordered by the government, but a spontaneous, uncontrolled flight driven by pure terror. Families pushed carts piled with burned blankets, suitcases, and pots. Others carried nothing but the clothes on their backs. Many walked barefoot, their shoes having melted or burned. Children cried from hunger. Elderly men collapsed from heat stroke. Women searched desperately for wells or streams not contaminated by debris. Local police forces tried to turn some back, arguing that leaving the city would complicate relief efforts, but the civilians ignored them. To stay meant death, and everyone knew it. Word of the mass flight spread throughout Germany, carried by soldiers rotating through the front, by railway workers, by whispered gossip in factories and villages. And in a nation where propaganda had long portrayed Germany as strong, unbreakable, protected by the Führer's promises, the truth was devastating. The Reich could not protect its people any more. And as that truth seeped into the public consciousness, doubts began to spread like cracks in a frozen lake. If Hamburg could burn like this, what would stop Berlin from burning next? What would stop Munich, Cologne, or any other city from becoming the next target? The fear that took root was no longer fear of bombs. It was fear of inevitability. Fear of a future where every night could bring another firestorm. Fear that the war Germany had unleashed upon the world had finally come back to consume it. And sitting in his bunker, surrounded by maps now stained with soot from the reports delivered to him, Hitler refused to see what his generals saw with crushing clarity: that the Allies had crossed a threshold, that their air forces were now engines of destruction on a scale beyond anything Germany could match, and that no amount of fanaticism, no speeches, no demands for sacrifice could change the cold reality written across Hamburg's ruins. Germany could be destroyed, and the Allies would not stop until it was. By the fifth night, Hamburg had ceased to function as a city in any recognizable sense. It had become a landscape of ruin, a scorched labyrinth of collapsed streets, skeletal buildings, and endless piles of rubble that smoldered beneath drifting curtains of ash. And yet the devastation alone was not what terrified Germany's leadership the most. It was the realization that the Allies could repeat this destruction at will, on any city they chose, at any hour they desired, with a level of coordination and technological sophistication that Germany could no longer dream of matching. As the fires still raged in the eastern districts, Allied intelligence units in England analyzed the effects of each attack in real time, recalibrating flight paths, adjusting bombing altitudes, and preparing the next waves with a brutal efficiency that made the bombers feel less like aircraft and more like instruments in a vast, orchestrated storm designed to break the will of an entire nation. In London, British commanders pored over reconnaissance photos showing the burnt-out husk of Hamburg, the neighborhoods reduced to ash, the roads buckled from heat, the industrial sites crippled beyond repair, and they spoke without celebration, without triumph, because they knew the consequences of their work. They understood that the firestorm had killed tens of thousands, that countless families had been torn apart, that the horrors unleashed were beyond imagination. Yet they also understood that this was the cost of dismantling a war machine that had enslaved Europe, murdered millions, and vowed to remake the world in its own violent image. And so the operations continued, not out of vengeance, but out of necessity. That same morning, as sunlight struggled to cut through the ash-choked sky, German engineers entered what remained of the industrial districts, Blohm and Voss shipyards, Krupp factories, engine assembly plants, and were confronted with scenes that made their knees weaken. Assembly lines warped into twisted ribbons of steel, gantry cranes lying on their sides like fallen giants. Entire workshops reduced to piles of slag, where the heat had melted machinery into unrecognizable lumps. The very infrastructure that powered Germany's navy, fueled its armies, and supplied its weapons had been gutted in days, undone by a single coordinated Allied effort that Germany had been powerless to stop. Engineers and administrators radioed Berlin with trembling voices, reporting that production estimates were no longer measurable in delays, but in annihilation. Some factories would need months to rebuild, others years, and some would never rise again. The U-boat fleet, once Hitler's pride, the wolves of the Atlantic, suddenly faced a crisis worse than Allied sonar or convoy escorts. There were simply not enough facilities left to build, repair, or maintain them. And as German officers tried to grasp the scale of this industrial collapse, civilians continued to pour out of Hamburg in a desperate tide, hundreds of thousands of refugees forming rivers of humanity flowing into the surrounding countryside, carrying babies wrapped in soot-blackened blankets, pushing makeshift carts with whatever possessions they could salvage, and wandering through villages that were completely unprepared for such an influx. Farmers offered water from wells. Church halls were converted into overcrowded shelters. Schools became refugee camps where traumatized children sat in silence, staring at walls with blank expressions that no one knew how to fix. Disease began to spread. Dysentery, heat stroke, respiratory collapse, because the combination of smoke, dehydration, and exhaustion was more than many could endure. German officials attempted to direct the flow of refugees using hastily printed leaflets and police checkpoints, but the sheer number overwhelmed every authority that tried to contain them. Soon, the country roads near Hamburg became clogged with bodies, living and dead, lying under the relentless summer sun. Yet even as Germany struggled simply to keep its civilians alive, the Luftwaffe faced its own nightmare. Fighter wings had been depleted by constant combat. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. Anti-aircraft artillery had consumed more shells in 4 nights than they had in the previous 2 months combined, and radar towers, already strained by the demands placed upon them, were starting to malfunction from overuse and bombardment. And still, the Allies kept coming. On the 5th night, the Americans returned once more. Their 17 formations glinting in the fading light as they thundered across the sky in perfect symmetrical grids that filled German radar screens with an ominous mass of dots. German fighters scrambled but could barely intercept a fraction of the incoming bombers, and those that tried found themselves flying into coordinated defensive fire that ripped through cockpits and wings with merciless precision. In one squadron, half the aircraft were shot down within minutes. The survivors limped back to base, their wings torn, their engines sputtering, their pilots limping from their cockpits with expressions that spoke of a bravery stretched beyond what any human being should ever be expected to endure. And below, Hamburg, what was left of it, endured its 5th consecutive night of terror as bombs rained down on rail yards, remaining fuel depots, and roads used by fleeing civilians. Explosions carved new craters into the earth, sending fireballs careening through alleys where survivors had sought shelter. Columns of flame erupted like volcanic blasts, lighting the night sky with an eerie glow that turned smoke clouds into burning red mountains hovering above the city. The screams of civilians mixed with the roar of collapsing structures, the thunder of detonations, the shrill whistle of falling incendiaries, all combining into a single, monstrous symphony of destruction that reverberated across the flattened districts like the death cry of a dying metropolis. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler listened to the latest reports in a bunker dimly lit by electric lamps that flickered each time an air raid struck somewhere across the country. For the first time, he received not one but multiple simultaneous reports of industrial collapse, mass civilian flight, complete loss of morale, and the utter failure of air defenses. Even some of his most loyal officers, men who had once proclaimed that the Luftwaffe would dominate the skies for the entirety of the war, now stood silent, staring at maps covered with red ink marking areas destroyed or uninhabitable. And as the reports grew more desperate, a shadow of something Hitler had rarely shown, fear, passed across his face. He realized that if the Allies chose to replicate this scale of destruction across other German cities, the Reich would not survive the year. But his response was one of denial and rage, not strategy. He ordered retaliatory attacks on British cities, demanded the reallocation of resources Germany did not have, and issued proclamations that the spirit of the German people would rise from the ashes stronger than ever. Yet no amount of shouting could undo the reality smoldering in Hamburg. The Allies had reached a level of destructive capability so overwhelming that Germany's defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a trajectory. And in the 5th night's inferno, as a city burned, a navy died, a population fled, and an enemy realized the war had turned irrevocably against them, the truth became inescapable even to those who refused to speak it aloud. Germany was no longer fighting to win, it was fighting to delay the inevitable. By the 6th night, the destruction of Hamburg had grown into something beyond even the comprehension of those who had witnessed its first flames. Something colossal, something elemental, something that felt less like the result of bombers and more like the wrath of a force that had descended from the heavens to consume a city that had once glowed with life, industry, and the bustle of 2 million souls. The sky above the ruins had taken on a sickly copper color, the sun filtering weakly through thousands of tons of smoke and ash suspended in the air, turning day into a perpetual twilight where every breath tasted of soot. Rescue crews who trudged through the rubble did so with the shuffling gait of the half-dead, their uniforms filthy, their eyes red from smoke, their lungs burning with each inhale. They no longer spoke except when necessary, because each word sent a stabbing pain through their throats. And still, they searched. They clawed through collapsed staircases, lifted charred beams with trembling hands, and crawled into pockets of rubble where faint cries had been reported hours earlier. Many times they emerged with children too burned to be recognized, or with entire families fused together in the positions they had died in, arms wrapped around each other as the firestorm's heat sucked the oxygen from their shelter, extinguishing life without leaving a single mark of flame. Others were found huddled near windows, overcome by carbon monoxide long before the fire itself reached them. The scenes were so horrific that even hardened soldiers retched upon seeing them, leaning against blackened walls as tears streamed down their ash-covered faces. Yet even as the living struggled with unimaginable loss, the machinery of the Nazi government continued its grim routine. Trains filled with refugees were rerouted across the countryside, overwhelming towns and villages unprepared for the influx. Railway platforms became makeshift morgues. Food supplies dwindled beneath the weight of new mouths to feed, and local officials begged Berlin for support they knew would never come. The Nazi propaganda ministry, desperate to maintain control over public morale, issued statements claiming that Hamburg citizens had endured the attacks with courageous unity, and that the destruction had been greatly exaggerated by enemy media. But these lies crumbled when photographs of the firestorm's aftermath circulated among Wehrmacht units, showing entire districts leveled into flat plains of ash, where not a single building remained standing. Even frontline soldiers, hardened by battles in Russia and Africa, stared in disbelief at the images, whispering among themselves that if the Allies could do this to Hamburg, what hope was left for the cities still untouched? And as the psychological shock rippled through the ranks, Allied commanders prepared yet another blow. Because while Germany reeled from the devastation, the RAF and USAF were determined to push through to the next phase of the campaign, one aimed not just at destroying a city, but at shattering the myth of German invulnerability so completely that even die-hard loyalists would feel doubt creeping into their bones. On the sixth night, the Allies returned once more, their aircraft emerging through the haze like metallic phantoms silhouetted against the glowing horizon of fire. The people who remained in Hamburg did not even need the sirens this time. The moment they heard the distant drone of engines, they scrambled for shelter, or more accurately, for whatever hole in the ground had not yet caved in. Many chose to run into the streets, hoping to outrun the fire, believing that being caught in the open was somehow preferable to being trapped underground. Others simply collapsed in exhaustion, too physically and emotionally drained to move, their eyes staring blankly into the sky as though accepting whatever fate descended upon them. In the air, RAF pilots were shocked to see flames still rising from the previous night's destruction, entire districts smoldering like coals in a gigantic furnace. Their mission for this night was surgical, to target points of infrastructure and transportation that had so far avoided complete destruction, the remaining rail hubs, the few oil tanks that still held fuel, the half-functioning bridges that survivors and relief teams depended upon. It was a strike designed to complete the collapse, ensuring that Hamburg would not recover its industrial capabilities for the remainder of the war. And as the bombs fell, explosions rippled across what remained of the city's frail skeleton, bridges collapsing into the Elbe with a thunderous splash, rail lines twisted out of shape, factories that had survived the previous nights finally torn apart in glorious plumes of debris that reached high enough to merge with the smoke clouds that had hovered for days. The harbour, once a symbol of German naval power, was transformed into a graveyard of sunken ships and burned-out warehouses, the water reflecting the flames like a mirror of hell. Even the mighty U-boat pens, constructed with hundreds of thousands of tons of concrete, shook under the bombardment, their entrances blocked by piles of rubble that made them unusable even if the submarines inside remained intact. German naval officers, huddled in their command bunkers, received the latest reports in frigid silence, understanding that the Atlantic War had suffered a blow from which it might never recover. Meanwhile, in Berlin, panic spread through the ministries. Reports from Hamburg were no longer sanitized. They were apocalyptic. The Interior Ministry warned that over 1 million people were now displaced. The Health Ministry reported tens of thousands dead, tens of thousands missing, and outbreaks of disease. The Economic Ministry admitted that the destruction of Hamburg's industries would cause crippling shortages in steel production, shipbuilding, and munitions. And the Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, confessed it could no longer guarantee the defense of Germany's airspace against raids of this magnitude. In the face of this overwhelming evidence, Hitler retreated deeper into denial, insisting that the attacks were only temporary setbacks, and that Germany would soon unleash retaliation that would turn the tide. But many of his generals, faced with the undeniable truth, quietly began to lose faith. They saw what Hitler refused to see, that the Allies had mastered a level of warfare that rendered Germany's strategy obsolete. While Germany relied on dwindling resources, the Allies built fleets of bombers faster than Germany could shoot them down. While German factories operated under blackout restrictions, Allied factories ran 24 hours a day. While Germany struggled to maintain supply lines, the Allies commanded seas, skies, and industrial output that dwarfed anything the Reich could ever hope to match. And so, as Hamburg endured its sixth night of terror, something more profound than buildings and factories collapsed: Germany's belief in its own invincibility. For the first time, the people, the soldiers, and even many within the government understood the truth that no propaganda could hide. The Allies were not just stronger, they were unstoppable. By the seventh night, Hamburg no longer resembled a city but a massive scar carved into the earth, a place where the boundaries between land and ash, sky and smoke, life and death had become so blurred that rescue crews navigating the ruins did so with the same haunted steps as soldiers walking through battlefield trenches. For even though the flames had started to ease, replaced by endless pillars of smoldering smoke, the heat still radiated from beneath the rubble like breaths escaping from a buried furnace, and as nighttime settled over the city once more, the glow of embers cast a dull red sheen across the broken horizon, making it appear as though the ground itself was bleeding. In these ruins, the survivors moved like shadows, slow, trembling, covered in soot, their clothes torn, their faces hollow with grief and exhaustion. Mothers held children who no longer cried because they no longer had the strength. Old men wandered aimlessly, clutching photographs charred around the edges. Young boys, their hair singed and their skin blistered, helped dig through debris in the hope of finding a family member still alive. Everywhere, silence settled over scenes that once would have been filled with the sounds of bustling streets, factory whistles, and laughter, now replaced only by the distant crackle of collapsing walls or the occasional sob of someone whose hope had just died in their arms. And yet, amid this heartbreaking tableau, something else had begun to happen, something subtle at first, but powerful in its inevitability. Germany's fear of the Allied bombers evolved into a deeper, more encompassing fear, not of the machines themselves, but of the realization that those machines were part of a system so vast, so relentless, and so technologically superior that resisting it no longer seemed brave, but foolish. German civilians, who had once listened to Hitler's speeches with hope, now sat in the basements of ruined buildings whispering that the Führer had lied, that the Luftwaffe could not protect them, that Germany's enemies were not weakening but growing stronger every night. The Reich's once unshakable propaganda machine had started to fracture as well. Goebbels's ministry, overwhelmed by the scale of the destruction, was forced to release fragments of the truth. Radio broadcasts, meant to reassure, instead carried a trembling undercurrent of panic. Newspapers, trying to highlight heroic firefighting efforts, inadvertently revealed the enormity of the disaster through the sheer magnitude of praise they felt necessary to offer. Even Nazi loyalists found themselves unable to look away from the undeniable evidence. Their cities were burning faster than the Reich could rebuild them, their fuel reserves were shrinking, their defenses were thinning, and their faith in Hitler as an infallible leader was bleeding away with each new casualty list. Meanwhile, far from the ruins, Allied leaders analyzed the psychological shockwaves spreading through German society. Intelligence reports from neutral countries, from intercepted communications, and from resistance networks made one thing clear. Operation Gomorrah had done more than devastate Hamburg's infrastructure. It had broken something inside the German people. Churchill, reading the reports, remarked privately to his generals that Germany had now experienced what London endured during the Blitz, but on a scale that dwarfed anything the Axis had ever inflicted. In Washington, analysts calculated the strategic impact: a quarter of Hamburg's industrial capacity annihilated, supply networks disrupted, tens of thousands of skilled workers dead, millions of citizens evacuated, spreading fear to other cities, and the Luftwaffe's inability to defend German airspace exposed with brutal clarity. And as the Allies assessed their success, they prepared to do what Germany feared most: escalate. Plans were drafted for further raids on industrial hubs: Essen, Düsseldorf, Stuttgart, Munich, all targets that would soon feel the same fire that had consumed Hamburg. The Allied air forces, no longer hesitant or uncertain, now operated with synchronized precision that Germany had once believed it alone possessed. The RAF Bomber Command and the USAF worked in tandem, the RAF striking civilian industrial centers at night with area bombing, and the USAF executing daylight precision raids aimed at crippling key manufacturing facilities. Germany, stretched across multiple fronts from Russia to North Africa to Italy, found itself overwhelmed not by the individual bombs themselves, but by the industrial might that produced those bombs faster than Germany could shoot down the planes that carried them. And on the ground in Hamburg, even the most hardened Wehrmacht veterans now felt the tremors of an enemy they could not reach, could not trick, could not stop. Soldiers returning from the front lines, accustomed to the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, walked through the ruins with disbelief etched into their faces, whispering to each other that not even Soviet artillery could match the scale of destruction that had been unleashed from the skies. One officer wrote in his diary, "If this is what one city looks like after a week, what will be left of Germany after a year?" His question, though private, reflected the sentiment creeping through the ranks, a morale collapse that no speech, no threat, no execution could fully reverse. And perhaps the darkest sign of all emerged in the hospitals, makeshift medical stations set up in schools, warehouses, even churches that had survived the flames. Doctors and nurses, many of whom had worked tirelessly through the Blitz on London or in field hospitals at the front, declared that they had never seen such injuries before, burns so deep that bone was exposed, lungs so damaged by smoke, and heat that victims suffocated in minutes, people so dehydrated from the firestorm's heat that their organs shut down despite water being poured over their lips. These scenes circulated through the minds of the German Medical Corps, spreading dread that the Allies had unlocked a new, terrifying form of warfare, one that even the strongest defences could not withstand. And as the night deepened into a suffocating darkness, punctuated only by the red glow of distant fires, something spiritual broke as well. Churches that had once echoed with hymns and patriotic speeches were now filled with refugees seeking something, anything, to give them strength, but the priests themselves struggled to offer comfort. They too had lost everything. They too had seen the firestorm. They too felt the terrifying truth in their bones, that Germany's enemies had reached a level of destructive power that no nation, no ideology, no army could outmatch. And in that moment, the final transformation occurred, not in the buildings, not in the streets, not in the factories, but in the hearts of the German people. The realization spread like a ripple across the ruined city, then across the nation. The Allies could not be stopped. By the 8th night, the scorched skeleton of Hamburg stood beneath a sky so thick with smoke that even the moon was reduced to a faint, ghostly blur, as if the heavens themselves were recoiling from the scale of devastation below. And in that suffocating darkness, illuminated only by the dim glow of still-burning embers scattered across the ruins, Germany's illusions, the illusions of superiority, of invincibility, of destiny, finally crumbled as completely as the buildings that now lay in fragmented heaps across miles of charred earth. The surviving citizens, huddled in basements or wandering through the ruins in a daze, no longer clung to hope but to instinct, moving with the slow, uncertain steps of those who had seen too much to dream of tomorrow. Their faces were hollow masks, their eyes reflecting not just exhaustion but a profound, soul-deep terror that could not be erased by propaganda or patriotic slogans. And as the smoke drifted across the city like a shroud, German soldiers, officials, and civilians alike began to understand a truth they had refused to acknowledge for years, that the war was no longer being fought on equal terms, and that the Reich's once vaunted power had been reduced to brittle fragments under the relentless assault of an enemy whose reach, resources, and organization dwarfed anything Germany could muster. In the corridors of the Reich Chancellery, officers whispered nervously about. If you already watched till this part, so please comment below your city name. Let's continue the story. The reports from Hamburg. Reports so horrific that even hardened generals struggled to look at the photographs without feeling their stomachs twist. They spoke of firestorms hotter than crematoriums, winds so fierce they tore children from their parents' arms, and explosions that left craters large enough to swallow entire apartment blocks. Some officers blamed the Luftwaffe for failing to protect the city, others blamed faulty defences, inadequate shelters, or sabotage. But beneath the excuses, a darker acknowledgement lingered. Germany was no longer fighting a war it could win. Even Hermann Göring, once bombastic and confident, received the aftermath reports with trembling hands, realizing that his promise, "No enemy aircraft will ever fly over the Reich," had become a bitter joke whispered in the ruins. And as the High Command debated futile strategies for retaliatory strikes, the reality outside their walls sharpened with every passing hour. Allied bombers now flew with near impunity, navigating with advanced radar systems that allowed them to glide through darkness as effortlessly as birds, while German night fighters, low on fuel, spare parts, and radar sets, struggled simply to take off, let alone intercept. The imbalance had grown so vast that it was no longer a contest but a demonstration of industrial might so overwhelming that even the Luftwaffe's bravest pilots could do nothing but watch helplessly as fleets of Allied aircraft passed overhead like thunderclouds. On the ground, the Wehrmacht units stationed near Hamburg tried to impose order among the growing masses of refugees fleeing the city, but the crowds, tens of thousands of them, moved with a kind of desperate momentum that no officer could fully control. Entire families pushed carts filled with whatever belongings they had managed to save. Widows carried bundles of clothing wrapped in blankets. Children clung to pets or toys, too traumatized to speak. Along the roads leading away from the city, long columns of refugees stretched into the night, illuminated occasionally by the flickering fires behind them or the headlights of passing military trucks. Villages and towns along the route struggled to cope, their supplies stretched beyond breaking, their residents overwhelmed by the influx of the wounded, the homeless, and the grieving. Yet even as the shock rippled outward from Hamburg, the Allied command continued its relentless push. American bombers targeted Germany's oil facilities, crippling the fuel that powered tanks, aircraft, and trucks. British forces struck industrial centers with mathematical precision, aiming to crush the factories that fed the German war machine. Every week, new waves of aircraft appeared in German skies, more advanced, more numerous, more coordinated. And while Germany scrambled to repair runways, rebuild factories, and train new Luftwaffe pilots, the Allies trained thousands more, their production lines humming with efficiency, their manpower seemingly endless. This imbalance spread like a shadow across every German military planning session. Generals who once boasted of blitzkrieg tactics now found themselves trapped in a defensive war they were structurally incapable of winning. They watched as fuel supplies dwindled to the point that training flights were reduced or cancelled. They saw factories working under blackout conditions, producing fewer and fewer munitions. They received reports of frontline divisions weakened by attrition, fighting increasingly desperate battles on the Eastern Front. And every time they looked again at the photographs of Hamburg's ruins, its melted streets, its collapsed buildings, its charred bodies, they understood with painful clarity that what had happened there could happen to any German city at any moment. Berlin, Munich, Cologne, Dresden, all lay within reach of Allied bombers whose numbers grew daily. In the minds of soldiers at the front and civilians in the homeland, a new terror took root, the terror that the skies above Germany belonged not to the Luftwaffe, not to the Reich, but to an unseen enemy whose power they could neither match nor escape. This psychological shift, this slow, creeping collapse of faith, was what truly broke Germany. Because once the people no longer believed victory was possible, once the soldiers began to suspect that their sacrifices were in vain, once the officers recognized that their strategies were obsolete, the war was no longer a fight for domination, but a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. And as the eighth night settled over the smoldering ruins of Hamburg, with the faint sound of collapsing buildings echoing like distant thunder, Germany realized, perhaps for the first time in the entire war, that the Allies were not merely stronger. They were unstoppable. By the ninth night, the devastation of Hamburg had moved beyond the physical realm and entered something far more profound, a national psychological collapse that spread through Germany like a silent contagion, slipping past propaganda walls and military discipline, seeping into every conversation whispered in bomb shelters, every radio broadcast interrupted by static, every train carrying refugees through the countryside, where stunned villagers stood at the tracks watching mile-long lines of shattered survivors pass with hollow eyes that reflected the end of something far bigger than a city. In Berlin, Munich, and Dresden, civilians who had once boasted of Germany's might now read the latest bulletins with trembling hands, realizing that if Hamburg, one of the Reich's most important industrial and cultural centers, could be reduced to a burning wasteland in a matter of days, Then nowhere was safe, not even Hitler's capital. And as rumors spread like wildfire, embellished by fear and confusion, the stories grew even more terrifying. Some whispered that the firestorm had melted asphalt into rivers. Others claimed that the winds generated by the inferno had sucked entire families into the flames. Others still spoke of smoke so thick it blotted out the sun for days. Whether true or exaggerated, the effect was the same. Germany's confidence shattered, replaced by a creeping dread that burrowed into the psyche of the nation. Soldiers stationed along the Eastern Front received letters describing the horrors, and even as they endured the brutality of Soviet offensives, the thought of their families suffering similar destruction back home gnawed at their morale. Officers who had once trusted in the Reich's carefully cultivated image of strength now found themselves staring at maps covered with red symbols representing Allied air raids, supply shortages, and collapsing infrastructure. They had been trained to think in terms of tactics, maneuvers, and enemy positions, but now they were forced to confront a different kind of enemy: the unstoppable, unrelenting productivity of Allied industry. American factories, operating around the clock, produced more bombers in a month than Germany could in a year. British radar systems detected German aircraft long before they could approach their targets, and Allied intelligence intercepted German communications with alarming accuracy. This realization, calculated in briefing rooms but felt deeply in the hearts of every German officer, marked a turning point in the war, a moment when even the generals understood that no matter how skillful their tactics, no matter how brave their soldiers, Germany could not win a war of attrition against nations with limitless resources and overwhelming technological advantage. Meanwhile, the streets of Hamburg, once bustling with merchants, sailors, musicians, and factory workers, had transformed into a nightmarish landscape of twisted steel and glowing ember pits. Every district had its own smell of ruin: charcoal, burnt rubber, scorched brick, and the faint, lingering scent of smoke-damaged flesh. Rescue teams navigated these labyrinths by memory, calling out into the silence for survivors who seldom answered. When they did find the living, the scenes were heartbreaking: children clinging to the bodies of parents who hadn't survived, families searching for any scrap of belongings, old men staring into the distance as if unable to comprehend the enormity of what had happened. And yet, even as the fires dimmed, the Allied bombers still came, not in the massive waves of earlier nights, but in precise, calculated attacks aimed at preventing recovery. Fuel depots that had survived the initial inferno were obliterated. Communication centers were struck again. Bridges that engineers had attempted to repair were reduced once more to rubble. The remnants of the railway lines, essential for evacuations and supply transport, were twisted by fresh explosions, leaving locomotives stranded on broken tracks. Each new raid, even if smaller, reinforced the message the Allies were sending. Their power was constant, their reach inevitable, and their intent unmistakable. This was not simply punishment, it was dismantling. And as that reality sank in, something unprecedented happened among the German population. Conversations about the future shifted from "how will we win?" to "how long until it ends?" Mothers whispering in bunkers no longer spoke of Allied invasions with dread, but with desperate hope that surrender might spare their children. Older men who remembered the First World War shook their heads and said the unthinkable, that this time Germany had no way out. Even die-hard Nazi loyalists felt doubt creeping in, a poison they tried to hide but could not eradicate. And while the people of Germany wrestled with fear and despair, Allied leaders studied the psychological impact with precision. Reports from neutral observers and resistance networks delivered messages that pleased them. The German spirit, once disciplined and fanatically motivated, was cracking. Morale was collapsing from the inside. The Firestorm scale had demonstrated not only Allied power, but the futility of German resistance. And so, the Allies accelerated their strategy. American B-17 and B-24 bombers continued daylight raids aimed at crippling oil production, the lifeblood of every tank, truck, and aircraft. British bombers pounded transportation networks night after night, ensuring that Germany's shattered cities remained isolated, unable to repair or reinforce themselves. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, now struggled to defend even a fraction of German airspace, Its inexperienced pilots rushed through training programs that were reduced from months to weeks due to fuel shortages and constant combat losses. Each day, more German cities faced the same terrifying pattern: the rising hum of engines, the whistle of falling bombs, the thunderous explosion, the rush of fire, and then silence broken only by the cries of survivors. What had happened to Hamburg was no longer an isolated tragedy. It was a preview, and in the hearts of the German people, that preview grew into certainty. The Reich could build new bunkers. It could reinforce anti-air defenses. It could repair runways and rebuild factories. But none of it mattered, not when the skies belonged to the Allies. And so, under the smouldering ruins of Hamburg, under the shadow of the bombers that still roared overhead, Germany confronted the truth it had denied for years, a truth more terrifying than any weapon: the Allies would not stop. They could not be stopped. And sooner or later the Reich would fall, consumed not only by the flames that had devoured Hamburg, but by the unstoppable force of an enemy that now held all the power, all the momentum, and all the skies. By the final night of Operation Gomorrah, when the last echoes of Allied engines faded into the distant darkness and the fires of Hamburg smouldered beneath a sky still glowing faintly red from the inferno that had consumed it, Germany entered a new and irreversible phase of the war, a phase defined not by confidence or ambition, but by resignation, dread, and the dawning understanding that the Reich's defeat was not merely possible but inevitable. For as Berlin received the full statistical reports, the numbers were staggering beyond belief. Entire neighborhoods annihilated in minutes. Tens of thousands dead, infrastructure reduced to ash, factories erased from existence, water systems collapsed, transportation networks shredded, and vital industrial centers crippled so deeply that even the miracle workers of German engineering could not repair them before winter. But the numbers told only a fraction of the story. What terrified Germany's leaders even more was the strategic revelation these reports made brutally clear. If the Allies could do this to Hamburg, one of Europe's largest, wealthiest, most important industrial cities, then they could do it to any German city they chose, at any time, in any weather, with increasing efficiency, and with forces so vast that even the total destruction of the Luftwaffe could not slow their momentum. And as this understanding spread through the military command, through Goebbels' propaganda ministry, through Hitler's bunker halls, and finally into the consciousness of ordinary citizens, the nation realized that they were no longer fighting a series of battles. They were drowning beneath a tidal wave of industrial, technological, and logistical power unlike anything the world had ever seen. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had been reduced to a shadow, its pilots young and inexperienced, its fuel rationed, its losses catastrophic. Germany's vaunted flak towers, designed to be impenetrable fortresses of anti-air power, were overwhelmed night after night by bomber streams stretching horizon to horizon, their formations so dense that even successful flak bursts barely dented the waves of aircraft above. Hitler's generals pleaded for resources they knew did not exist: more fuel, more steel, more planes, more trained manpower, but each request was met with the same grim silence, the same tightening of jaws, the same haunted eyes that betrayed the truth. There was nothing left to give. The Reich, once overflowing with stolen wealth, forced labor, and war plunder, found itself unable to keep pace with a coalition of nations whose industrial output dwarfed all of Europe. The United States alone was producing more planes, tanks, and ships in a single year than Germany and its allies could produce in 3. And Britain, bombed and battered but unbroken, had transformed into a fortress of continuous production, refining precision bombing techniques and radar systems that made nighttime raids ever more devastating. But beyond the numbers, beyond the tactics, beyond the flames, the true breaking point for Germany came from something far more psychological, something the Firestorm had made undeniable. 4 years, Nazi propaganda had assured the German people that the war was righteous, that the Führer was invincible, that the Reich would rise for 1,000 years. But now, with the ashes of Hamburg rising into the sky like a funeral pyre, even the most loyal citizens saw the cracks in the facade. They saw trains packed with refugees fleeing cities once believed untouchable. They saw piles of charred rubble where shops, theaters, and homes had stood for generations. They saw factories, once symbols of national pride, silenced forever. And most frightening of all, they saw Allied bombers return again and again, with timing so precise and confidence so complete that it felt less like war and more like execution. In Hitler's inner circle, whispers began, unthinkable whispers, of defeat, of negotiation, of survival. Generals argued among themselves over blame, strategy, and despair. Some blamed Göring for failing to protect the skies. Others blamed Hitler for unrealistic orders. Others blamed fate, destiny, or some divine justice echoing across a continent that had suffered under German conquest for years. Even the SS, once unwavering in fanaticism, found itself shaken by the sheer scale of destruction and the realization that loyalty could not stop bombs, ideology could not extinguish flames, and terror could not rebuild entire cities in a night. Meanwhile, in the Allied world, Operation Gomorrah was seen as more than a bombing success. It was proof that victory was not only possible but inevitable. Churchill, reading the reports, remarked that Germany had reaped the whirlwind. Roosevelt praised the cooperation between American and British forces. Allied commanders studied the Firestorm's meteorological data, analyzing how weather patterns, building density, and bomb distribution created such catastrophic results, information they would soon apply to other cities across the Reich. The strategic bombing campaign, once debated, was now seen as a decisive weapon. And the German people, who had once believed the war would end quickly and triumphantly, now braced for a future defined by fire. But for all its horror, the night Hamburg burned marked something even larger, a metaphor for the collapse of an entire regime. Because the firestorm did not only consume buildings and factories, it consumed illusions. It consumed the myth of German invincibility. It consumed the belief that Hitler could protect his people. It consumed the confidence that had fueled German aggression since 1939. And with that illusion gone, the war entered its final chapters, not with triumphant speeches or bold offensives, but with the slow, inevitable grinding down of a nation that understood, at last, that it had awakened enemies it could never defeat. The night Germany realized the Allies couldn't be stopped wasn't a single event. It was a transformation, a turning point where the Reich saw the writing on the wall written not in ink, but in flames stretching miles into the darkened sky. And from that night forward, Germany fought not to win, but to delay the inevitable, to cling to whatever fragments of hope remained as the world closed in around them. Because after Hamburg, after the firestorm, after the inferno that consumed a city and shattered a nation's spirit, there was no more denying the truth. The Allies were unstoppable, and the end of Nazi Germany had already begun. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.